When we hear the debate about Justin Fields, it always seems to be about one of the two extremes. Either he's a bust who can't throw the ball and the Bears are going to need to draft a quarterback again soon, or he's a future MVP who's going to put it all together and lead this team to championships. But I think we don't talk enough about the more likely outcome, which is somewhere in the middle.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We love our everydayers that tune in 5 days a week. Today's episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp connects you with a licensed therapist who can take you on the journey of self-discovery from wherever you are. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. On the show today, we explore the range of outcomes for Justin Fields and what that looks like in his development in terms of how that would manifest itself on the field, what it would take to get there, and how it would shape the Chicago Bears' short and long-term future. And I really want to look at both the boom and the bust sides of the spectrum, but also this middle ground of like, okay, he's not a bust who the Bears have to get rid of, but maybe he's not the boom who's going to be the next Patrick Mahomes and carry the Chicago Bears to a bunch of Super Bowls and a dynasty either. That more likely, he's probably going to fall somewhere in the middle and maybe be a little bit inconsistent, sometimes great, sometimes not always great, and not, this future Hall of Famer per se, but still potentially a very good quarterback for the Chicago Bears. And I want to pin down a little bit more what that might look like, because doesn't seem to be part of much of the discussion we hear about Justin Fields, right? We're going to hear the offseason hype train start building up more and more. This always sort of happens in usually like year two, not necessarily year two of the quarterback, but especially year two in the same system. So sometimes it's the quarterback's second year, but also like second year in the same system. It'll be Fields' third year is when this will start to pick up, right? This happened not in Justin Fields' second season because that was, not in Mitch Trubisky's second season because that was his first year with Matt Nagy, but Mitch Trubisky's second season with Matt Nagy was like when the hype train started building of like, oh, okay, like he's taking these steps forward and it's going to be this next step. And it doesn't always happen exactly that way, but this is the timing of when it starts to happen. We've already heard Luke Getsy say that Fields is light years ahead of where he was last year. He's going to build rapport with these receivers, and we're going to hear all this hype about how great things are coming together at practice during the offseason, and then it's going to build up these expectations for the regular season. And so I think then it's important for us to look at the range of outcomes that could come from this point, that we're expecting Fields to take a step forward, and either he takes a big step forward, a little step forward, or maybe not nearly big enough of a step forward. And that's what I kind of want to compare and contrast a little bit here. Like, let's start with the fun stuff, like the boom, what the high end here of what the ideal pathway is for Justin Fields. Because he's not, I mean, I don't know if it's ridiculous. I don't know if it's reasonable to expect him to be like, Patrick Mahomes. No one's saying he's going to be Patrick Mahomes, but perhaps, an MVP who can throw all the way, up and down the field and also be a dynamic threat with his legs, a la like Jalen Hurts from last year. Like that seems to be kind of the high end of the range of outcomes for Justin Fields. That looks like being a potential 4,000 yard guy, right? A guy who sets all the Bears franchise passing yards in a single season. Cause I mean, let's be honest, they're not super high bars to pass. And then keep in mind too, that Jalen Hurts didn't even throw for 4,000 yards last year. It was 3,700, 22 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. But obviously 14-1 as a starter is the number that is most important for what Jalen Hurts was able to do and how we'll ultimately measure Justin Fields' success moving forward. That when you have a mobile quarterback like this, whose legs are such an important part of the weapon that he is, straight passing yards, touchdowns, and interceptions are not the holistic way to evaluate his performance, much like we saw this past season, just to a lesser degree. But you could see where, given that they've upgraded the offensive line, they've significantly upgraded at wide receiver, they've added some more depth pieces at tight end and at running back, you start to have an offensive support system plus another year in Luke Getsy's system, that things can start to come together for Fields, and the passing mistakes can be cut down and the miscommunications can be cut down, and the receivers can help make him right more often than not, and even when he's wrong, make him look right and take short plays and turn them into big plays that ultimately the quarterback ends up getting credit for. And you can start to build this system and this scenario in this world where Fields really does take that step forward. I mean, the pieces and the direction seems to be there, right? It's not like you have to make some logical leap, like he goes, like that there's an unanswered question. Well, we don't know how exactly we get from point A to point B. Like, you can see it, right? There's a clear path of, like, yes, if the receivers play better and the offensive line plays better and the system's more comfortable, like, all these steps get you to Fields playing a lot better and trying to make that Jalen Hurts type jump forward this season, or certainly like next season, like the year after this upcoming season, to be that difference maker, long-term franchise quarterback for the Chicago Bears that, a year from now, we're starting to have the conversations about what his next contract would then look like, because we've seen, guys like Joe Burrow and Justin Herbert be in, and of course then Lamar Jackson be in these sort of like, give him the contract a year early type conversations. Like, that's the high end of this range of outcomes, this boom or bust or somewhere in the middle for Justin Fields. And it sets them up then to use their 2 first-round picks and salary cap space next year to bolster this team around him even further, to try and squeeze that much more out of him and maybe make the defense even that much better to make his job easier, and see if you can get even more weapons and even more stability on the offensive line, right? There's you can keep tweaking more and more and more to get the maximum Justin Fields for 2024 and feel like you're set for the long term at quarterback, and you finally answered the Chicago Bears' desperate need for the franchise quarterback. The pathway is certainly there. You can also see where some of the logic comes from for people that doubt Justin Fields and that don't know if he can take that step forward. And I think it's important to keep in mind, like, what this looks like then as we think about the range of outcomes for him. And I think by understanding the high end, like we just talked about, and understanding the low end, like we're going to talk about next, we can better then have good context and bounds through which we can understand what this middle ground might look like for Justin Fields. And that's the big point I want to get to towards the end of today's podcast. But let's plug our nose a little bit and, dip our toe in the water that we don't want to jump into, with the idea that what if things don't go well for Justin Fields, so we can understand the highs and the lows and where the middle ground ends up somewhere in between, next on Locked On Bears. This episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp is here to provide easy and affordable mental health services, with online therapy connecting you one-on-one with a therapist from the comfort of your own home. I do online therapy every single week, and it's a really important part of my mental health regimen. I always like to say it's like going to the gym, but for my brain. Like, I don't go to the gym because my body is broken and needs to be healed, but I go to the gym to stay in the best shape and, be as healthy and fit as I can physically. That's why I go to therapy too, to be as mentally healthy and mentally fit as I can, even though it's not about being like in a crisis or just needing a life raft or anything like that. It's just about being the best you that you can be. If you've thought about starting therapy, BetterHelp is a great way to try it because it's convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You fill out a brief questionnaire and they match you with a licensed therapist. But, if the first one's not the right fit for you, you can switch them at any time for no additional charge. Find more balance in your life with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. We think that BetterHelp for Justin Fields will promote his development and have him grow as a quarterback this season and get further down the line towards being the quarterback that the Chicago Bears want him to be. And it sure seems like he's certainly not going to go backwards this season. And we feel very confident that he's going to get better. It's a question of how much better. But there is the possibility that maybe he doesn't take nearly as big of a step as you would like him to take. And that falls on the possibility of this list and this range of possible outcomes for Fields that I think is important context to understand then where the middle ground might land. That if Justin Fields busts at this point. And bust even feels like it would be a bust based on where he was drafted and, of course, like expectations. But like certainly Fields is not going to get any worse than what we saw last year, right? He's not going to go backwards from that point. Like we know, like last year, like at a minimum, if last year was the worst we see of Justin Fields, he's still a guy who can make phenomenal plays with his legs and, was one of the higher scoring offenses during the middle portion of the season when everything was clicking for him and can do some better things. And you imagine, like, even if just the receivers are better, even if Fields never gets better, there should be some offensive improvement in that regard. But it might not be then the guy that you truly believe in as your long-term quarterback. That if Justin Fields doesn't get any better, specifically as a passer from last season, that's not a guy that you're going to give then like a big-time quarterback contract to. And you start to have these conversations about, when you start to think about making that change. Like, I think what that ultimately looks like is a guy who hits some deep shots downfield every once in a while, but continues to miss some of the easy throws underneath, like we saw this past season. I think it looks like a guy who would, continue to hold on to the ball too long, maybe take some unnecessary sacks when he's trying to escape the pocket and just, where you get frustrated over time, eventually, like you got to just get rid of it and be more decisive. And maybe that processing speed never quite speeds up in terms of being able to make those downfield decisions with the ball. There were times last year when he made a few throws here and there that were a little bit questionable. To me, it wasn't always like, what the heck are you doing? Terrible decision. But it's more like, I saw what you were trying to do and you kind of had the right idea, but the timing and the execution ended up not being correct. And like, you like the effort and the intensity, but it's just like not then, not there, not that way exactly. And maybe this is the sort of pathway here where those types of situations, those types of errors don't get cleaned up and continue to be a part of his game that you just have to live with. And you get through this season and it's another perhaps underperforming passing production in that season. Still some nice runs in there, but if we get through year 3 without significant passing progress, then we start to really question, like, okay, can this guy be effective of enough of a passer that, when crap hits the fan, I don't know a better way to like use that phrase without swearing, but like, when your back's against the wall and it's the playoffs and it's fourth down in the final 2 minutes and you need a throw, can you trust the guy to make that throw? It's some of the same questions there were about Lamar Jackson earlier in his career and other quarterbacks throughout the years, like guys who have been mobile, but you haven't been able to fully trust as a passer. And I think this type of pathway that you go down for Justin Fields, you start to feel like, okay, the Bears put better receivers around him and a better offensive line in front of him and better, more depth at tight end in the backfield. And he doesn't take that step forward. At some point, you kind of have to say, okay, if he's not taking the step forward, then when is he going to take the step forward? It's certainly no one is going to sit here and say that the circumstances in 2023 are just perfect, right? No one's saying that any quarterback should be able to be successful here, that the Bears can't improve at any of these positions and that this is like the perfect ideal supporting cast for a quarterback. No, it's a lot better than last season, and it should be enough. It should be good enough for a very good quarterback to be successful with this kind of offensive supporting cast specifically. But it's not going to be perfect. So we can sort of understand that it's not like, oh, perfect situation, Fields has to thrive or else that means he's a bust. But like, it's enough of an improvement that he needs to match that kind of an improvement. And if he doesn't, you start to wonder, like, does adding even more at receiver and offensive line then somehow fix it? Or is it just sort of like he's just never going to quite get it in the NFL and it just is not something he's going to be able to catch up to? Because you start to look then at your own resources and you see 2 first-round picks in the 2024 NFL draft with what's right now projected to be a strong quarterback class with the likes of Caleb Williams and Drake May, the North Carolina quarterback at the top there, plus some other guys that could creep up into that conversation. And just like Ryan Poles looked at the QBs this year just to make sure, he's going to look at the QBs next year if there's question marks about Fields. And maybe that's the time that you then make the decision to change the quarterback position and draft the next guy and say, you know what, like, we like Justin Fields, but he hasn't shown us enough growth at that stage then to merit the type of money that quarterbacks get nowadays. If you're a quarterback that ends up on the end of your rookie contract, you're either going to get a big long-term deal to stay with your team, or you don't stay with that team and you probably end up going as either like a backup or a guy who's going to be competing to start in like a platoon on some team. Or maybe the Bears, bring him back on a 1-year prove it thing and have a platoon type thing. But right, it's the contract for quarterbacks now is kind of boom or bust. There's not much of a middle class of quarterbacks. Like, Daniel Jones and Geno Smith got sort of middle class quarterback contracts, but they're still really expensive. They're not Patrick Mahomes, Deshaun Watson, Lamar Jackson expensive, but they're still really expensive. And everyone feels like Daniel Jones got overpaid. Maybe Geno Smith got overpaid. I think that's debatable, but I think Daniel Jones was definitely like overpaid on that contract. And that's the situation you would start to get in with Justin Fields if you didn't see enough of that step forward. And I don't necessarily think you would at that point. And the Bears probably wouldn't be willing to pay him what the Giants gave Daniel Jones, because Jones at least had one pretty strong year this past year of finally putting it all together that we're not really confident he can maintain. And in this sort of bust scenario that we're going through with Fields, he wouldn't have that season of putting it all together. And I feel like he'd be looking at, a Trubisky contract that you got from the Steelers, right? As a kind of, or with the Bills first and then the Steelers, like kind of a 1 year at a time, compete to start and maybe have high upside as a backup that someone else thinks they can get more out of him, but might not ever become a full-time starting quarterback in the league again. Like, that to me feels like the low end of the outcome range for Justin Fields. So the thing that stands out to me, though, is that there's a lot of space in between, bust quarterback who kind of just becomes a backup from there that never lived up to his potential, and MVP Jalen Hurts level ascension to Super Bowl contending quarterback. Like, most starting quarterbacks at least fall somewhere in between that range. And it feels most likely to me that Justin Fields probably falls in between that range. I don't think it's likely that he's going to be a superhero, superstar, Hall of Famer. And I don't think it's super likely that he's just going to never get better and kind of bust out of the league that way. I think it's most likely that he's very good, but not Hall of Fame great, but not bad, got to replace him either. So we'll take a closer look at what this middle ground might look like for Justin Fields by using some other sort of fairly recent quarterback comparisons next on Locked On Bears. I think it's important that we have the high and the low end context as we try and find the middle ground for Justin Fields. And it's important to also keep in mind that there's something fairly unique about Fields to where there's no perfect comparison from like another recent quarterback that we can point to as be like, oh, this is probably the trajectory that Justin Fields is on, because there are so few quarterbacks that have the kind of skill set Justin Fields has that it's a very small sample to be able to choose from. Like Justin Fields' career, the middle ground to me is not like Lamar Jackson, for example. Like, it's not really a super close one-to-one comparison there. Like, Lamar Jackson has had a very sort of strange, kind of enigmatic career. Like, but he's also been an MVP and a multi-time Pro Bowler, and like there's still like a lot of great Lamar Jackson ahead of him. I don't think we've seen peak Lamar Jackson just yet. So it's hard to say like, oh, Fields is going to go down that trajectory because Lamar's only been in the league like 2 more years than Fields, right? It's not like we have this long path of an actual trajectory to follow for Fields, for example. But like, there aren't very many other quarterbacks as athletic as Fields that have such an important part of their game coming from their legs as part of a really important part of the evaluation, in addition to the passing game. I think when I try and envision what a middle ground looks like for Fields, that's not MVP, Hall of Fame caliber guy and not bust guy, I think some, and again, there's no perfect comparison here, but the thing I've found the most agreement with, I think personally, is like some of the Cam Newton years when he wasn't an MVP. Like Cam Newton threw for 4,000 yards once in his career. It was his rookie season. He was Rookie of the Year and made the Pro Bowl. And of course, he was the MVP in 2015 and had a career high 35 touchdowns and pretty darn strong season, taking that team to the Super Bowl and losing. If we're trying to say a middle ground here, I think Fields wouldn't peak quite as high as Cam Newton. But like, you look at the rest of Newton's seasons, he's in the 33 to 3,800 range each year. Like 33, let's say the second year was like 38, then 33, 31, 38, 35, 33, 34. Like, those were kind of his passing numbers each year. He was in the touchdown range anywhere from like 18 to 25 most seasons, and interception range ranging from like 10 to 17. With Cam Newton, like, there were always big explosive plays downfield and great plays with his legs, especially at the goal line, that single-handedly he was able to keep his team in some games and make some plays where his teammates to elevate their play, and when they weren't able to come up where he needed them to be, he could make up for it at times. And there were other times when Cam Newton would just be inaccurate. And when he would throw some interceptions, they were just like, damn it, Cam, why'd you throw the ball there? Like, and to me, I wonder if that's the type of feeling that a Justin Fields middle ground looks like, where he's scoring a lot of points with the offense, right? It's not like the offense is struggling. But and he's going to get some big play touchdowns. He's going to make some great plays with his legs, throw the ball downfield and air it out. But maybe he still misses some of the easy underneath throws that sometimes you're like, man, why can't you just, the little slant there? Why was that one too far in front? Or why was that curl at the receiver's feet? Like, why do we still have these little inaccuracies here and there 5-6 years into his career, like when he's in his prime? I think like, Cam Newton after the Super Bowl, those 3 years afterwards, like he was pretty darn good, but wasn't a Pro Bowler those years, wasn't an MVP those years, and his team made the playoffs one of the years, but then they were also kind of bad around him a few of those years too, and like he wasn't able to overcome a completely terrible supporting cast, kind of like Justin Fields was last season. Newton was certainly better than Fields was last season, but the idea is the Fields will be better by that stage of his career. Like, again, it's not a one-to-one comparison. I'm not here to say like that's exactly how it would go, but it's that kind of energy, right? Like maybe it's somewhere in between like Newton and like Ryan Tannehill, where like Tannehill always had pretty good numbers, but it was never enough to really get his team past the finish line. And the Dolphins didn't really support him super well. They always had offensive line troubles, and the receivers there were kind of up and down over the years, and they tended to hover around 8-8 a lot of those seasons. And then he had some injuries in there as well, but his legs were able to make some plays for them, but he was never, like, I think Fields is already a more dynamic playmaker than Ryan Tannehill ever was. But like, if we put like Ryan Tannehill as the boring and Newton as like, Tannehill is the low and Newton as the high of like what the middle ground would look for Justin Fields, maybe it's somewhere in between there. Like, I think passing wise, if somebody like Carson Palmer, like where, yeah, like he's good. I think he made a couple of Pro Bowls in there and led his team to some playoff runs, but like Palmer had some inconsistency in there too. Like, I think that's ultimately what it looks like for Fields, is like really great play with still some inconsistency. That's what the middle ground is. There's these high ends that make you feel like, yeah, he's got that MVP playmaking ability in him. We just don't see it all the time. Kind of like it's not as often as like, like Jalen Hurts this season really cut down on the inconsistency and was just more consistently taking care of the ball and making those big plays, having a lot more of the high end and a lot less of the low end than we saw earlier in his career. And I wonder if for Fields, the middle ground between his peak and his lowest is still maintaining some of that inconsistency there. I mean, maybe like some of peak Michael Vick years, like that year in Philadelphia with Chip Kelly, a couple of those years there where, he was still only throwing for 3,300 yards, here and there, and 18 to 20 touchdowns and, 10 or 15 interceptions there. Like, it wasn't like the numbers lit the league on fire, but he went 8-3 and made the Pro Bowl and was the comeback player of the year in 2010. And it was like, oh, like that's a playmaker at quarterback, even though it's not in the traditional statistical measure. Like, it wasn't the most impressive passing season in NFL history, but it got the job done and carried that team pretty far before he got hurt. And then I think, we saw a few different backups go in there and kind of struggle and flame out there. But like, that's sort of the middle ground I'm meshing between here with Fields. Again, really trying to be careful to say not a one-to-one comparison to like Vic exactly or Newton exactly, or certainly not Tannehill exactly. But if we take little bits and pieces of those kind of guys to form what might look like a middle ground for Justin Fields, to me, that's a guy who is good enough to stick around as your long-term quarterback option to justify continuing to build around him. And I think that's a quarterback who's good enough that if you keep putting good receivers, a good offensive line, and good running backs and tight ends around him and a good defense, like that middle ground Justin Fields is good enough to get you to a Super Bowl. Like, with enough support, he can get you to a Super Bowl. If he's lacking in support, the team is not going to be great. Like, they might, you're a wild card team. You're a 9-win team. You maybe get to the second round here or there, but really, like, he's good enough to get you to the playoffs, but he's not good enough to get you to the Super Bowl without having a really good team around him. That's the middle ground of Justin Fields that I see, and it feels like perhaps that's more likely than either the high end, like the extreme high end, or the extreme low end. I would love to hear what you think the middle ground might look like for Justin Fields in his Bears career. What's the most likely outcome for Fields that's not big boom Hall of Famer, big bust out of the league? Where do you see that middle ground? Let us know in the comments here on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel. You can tweet us at Locked On Bears or me at Cox Sports 1. You can post in the Locked On Bears Facebook group as well. Keep the conversation going there. However you do it, just make sure you're subscribed to Locked On Bears, wherever you listen to podcasts or on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Really appreciate you making Locked On Bears your first listen today and hopefully every single day. We love our everydayers here on the Locked On Podcast Network. We're your team every day. And if it is your team and you are there every day, you're one of our everydayers and we absolutely love you. If you're not an everydayer, that's okay. We love you too, but you can join the club, become an everydayer that's tuning in 5 days a week. Really appreciate some of the love we were getting as well over in the Locked On Bears Facebook group. Sort of, completely unprompted, but we got a post in there from Dan Olson who said, I listened to several Bears podcasts, but Lorin Cox and Locked On Bears is my favorite. Thank you, Lorin, for all your hard work. Dan, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. Like, stuff like this kind of reminds me that, of why I do it. When I sit here and do the podcast, I'm functionally sitting here talking into a microphone and kind of to myself. And I, of course, I hear from people about listening and stuff, but to see it in the audience and to get that direct feedback, I really appreciate it. And I'm always open to suggestions as well. If there's things you think I should do differently or better, or if you have ideas for what we should do on the podcast, please let me know. Again, Twitter, Facebook group, YouTube comments. I read all of your tweets, all of your Facebook posts, all of your YouTube comments. I do read every single comment that we post on there. So I really appreciate everyone who shares that feedback, who tunes in and makes Locked On Bears your first listen today and every day. And in exchange, I hope at the very least, I give you an opportunity each day to bear down.